Srimad-Bhagavatam class today, Friday. Always forgetting the date during lockdown. What are we at? We are at the 16th of April. I will just chant a little Jai Radha Madhava to begin. Hare Krishna. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jayara Amadava Kunja Bihari Jayara Amadava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jayara Amadhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Jaya Gopi Janavallava Girivardhari Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jayara Amadhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. A reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, Dhṛtarāṣṭra quits home, and today we're reading text 9. Kaya vritavaditam vas Charadbi Shiti Mandalam Tirtani Shetra Mukyani Sevitani Kabutale Kaya Vritavaditam Vas Charadbi Shiti Mandalam Tirtani Shetra Mukyani Sevitani Habutale Kaya Vritavaditam Vas Charadbi Shiti Mandalam Tirtani Shetra Mukyani Sevitani Habutale. Kaya vrita varitam vas charadbi shiti mandalam tirtani shetramukyani sevitani abhutale. Kaya, by which, vrija means, varitam, maintained your livelihood, va, your good self, charadbi, while travelling, shiti mandalam, on the surface of the earth, tirtani, places of pilgrimage, kshetramukyani, the principle of holy places, sevitani, served by you, iha, in this world, bhutale, on this planet. Translation. While travelling on the surface of the earth, how did you maintain your livelihood? At which holy places and pilgrimage sites did you render service? And just to recap, this is a question, these questions are being asked by Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira. He's asking Vidura these questions. So he says, while travelling on the surface of the earth, how did you maintain your livelihood? At which holy places and pilgrimage sites did you render service? Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Vidura went out from the palace to detach himself from household affairs, especially political intrigues. As referred to herein before, he was practically insulted by Duryodhana's calling him a son of a Sudrani, although it was not out of place to talk loosely in the case of one's grandmother. Vidura's mother, although a Sudrani, was the grandmother of Duryodhana, and funny talks are sometimes allowed between grandmother and grandchildren. But because the remark was an actual fact, it was unpalatable talk to Vidura, and it was accepted as a direct insult. He therefore decided to quit his paternal house and prepare for the renounced order of life. This preparatory stage is called Vanaprastha Ashram, or retired life, for travelling and visiting the holy places on the surface of the earth. In the holy places of India, like Vrindavan, Hardwar, Jagannath Puri and Prayag, there are many great devotees, and there are still free kitchen houses for persons who desire to advance spiritually. Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira was inquisitive to learn whether Vidura maintained himself by the mercy of the free kitchen houses, chatras. Translation again. While travelling on the surface of the earth, how did you maintain your livelihood? At which holy places and pilgrimage sites did you render service? Om Ajana Tamarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayarupa Gadamayam Dadati Swa Padantikam Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. As mentioned, these are questions that Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira is asking of Vidura, and Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira was naturally concerned about his uncle like that, as we all tend to be about family members, making sure that they're kind of being looked after and maintained nicely. But it is very interesting in the purport. The first thing that jumps out is the point being made about Vidura wanting to detach himself, especially from political intrigues. And you can see in a kind of royal household, this is like, in that sense, no ordinary household. And you can see in a royal household, you can imagine all the different political intrigues that would take place. So Vidura wanted to detach himself from those because he was seeing those as a encumbrance, as a obstacle in terms of him developing and progressing his spiritual life at this stage of his life. Then I noted about the loose talk in families, and sometimes there can be loose talk about the grandparents with the grandchildren, etc. And that's also natural within families, and sometimes all the parents out there and indeed the grandparents, it can be quite interesting because the kids sometimes can say things that can be on the face of it embarrassing for the parents or the grandparents, because kids are kids, they'll just speak like that. Of course, these were grown-up kids in that sense, Duryodhana, etc. But to some degree, there's license for that. However, what Prabhupada is mentioning here in the purport is that because there was truth to the quote-unquote loose talk or joke that Duryodhana was speaking, because it was actually true. In English, we have this phrase, joke with a jag, that it's a joke, but it's actually also intended to penetrate and also intended to hurt, basically, because there is truth behind it. And that was unpalatable for Vidura. We're talking here about his mother, and she's being minimized and undermined and talked of in a kind of negative way like that. So what did he do? He decided that he would quit the household for all these different reasons, and set out and visit all the different holy places in India. And of course, visiting holy places is a glorious thing. Many devotees have done it. I was just looking there of the 4 places mentioned. 2 of them I've been to. I've been to Vrindavan and I've been to Jagannath Puri. Specifically because those places, if you like, are so, Vrindavan is so directly connected with Lord Krishna. It's Lord Krishna's where he appeared. And Jagannath Puri, of course, is so connected to Lord Jagannath. There may be some devotees of Lord Jagannath, I'm sure, I hope there are devotees of Lord Jagannath listening, but particularly devotees who have an affinity to Odisha and Jagannath Puri like that. So that's very natural. Of course, for devotees in the line of Srila Prabhupada, so essentially all ISKCON devotees, the visiting of holy places is wonderful, and as Srila Prabhupada used that phrase, it recharges, visiting them and diving deep into your bhajan, your sadhana, that it recharges your spiritual batteries to do that. But of course, just visiting holy places isn't really in the mood of Srila Prabhupada. He, of course, was in a holy place in Vrindavan and Radha Damodar temple when he was 69 years of age, so he'd gone beyond the Vanaprastha stage. He was now sannyas in the last stage of life. But still, he left the holy place to go and spread the message of Krishna consciousness. So for followers of Prabhupada, that's very much the standard bearer, that it's not just visiting holy places, but it's also sharing Krishna consciousness with others. So that's so anyway. But Vidura, because of all these intrigues and insults, etc., etc., he decided now he was really going to delve deep into his spiritual life and leave all that stuff behind, and just absorb himself in Krishna and thoughts of Krishna like that. And he went, and then it's interesting at the end because, it says Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira was inquisitive to learn whether Vidura maintained himself by the mercy of the free kitchen houses, chatras. That's interesting. Again, being concerned. Prabhupada, of course, had that statement that within a 10-mile radius of Mayapur, our world headquarters, that, we should feed all the hungry people. And his point essentially was that you cannot give people philosophy if they're starving, it's just the whole mind and everything becomes absorbed in your hunger. Naturally so, we all have to eat. So anyway, it was just interesting that Yudhiṣṭhira was wondering, is this how Vidura maintained himself? Because maintaining our livelihood is something that's pretty much a constant anxiety for people. And as I say, even here we see Yudhiṣṭhira, out of concern for his uncle Vidura, was asking him how did he manage to maintain himself. And it's interesting, it just reminded me when I was reading that, it reminded me of one story from, Vedic India, that I'm not sure if Srila Prabhupada directly cited it, but certainly it's a story that's been cited over the years. But it's a story about a beggar who once came to a king's residence. So, you know, there are parallels here because we're talking about a royal household. So this beggar, he came to a king's residence, and he basically came because he was struggling, and of course, you know, the prime duty of any leader, of any king or head of state, is that they provide for the citizens. They protect the citizens, provide and protect for the citizens. Prabhupada makes that point many, many times throughout his writings. Indeed, the head of state is automatically accepting 1/6. So, whatever 1/6 is in percentage, 1/5 is 20%, I know that much. So, I don't know, 17, 18%. That the king, the head of state, is accepting the karma of all of the citizens. So here we're sitting in Ireland, which is a very small country, of course, of roughly 5 million people. So you're talking roughly 1 million people, maybe slightly less. Oh, no, sorry, not 1 million people, sorry. But there are 5 million people. So the head of state, be interesting to know who would want to jump forward and claim to be the head of state in Ireland. Would that be the president? Or would that be the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach? Not sure. But one of those anyway is accepting, you know, thereabouts 18% of the karma of 5 million people. So it's just quite interesting. Anyways, so the beggar, he came to the king's residence, and he was looking, he was hungry. The king just happened to be out on the balcony and saw him, and saw him coming and knocking on the door. So he sent his servant to see, you know, who was there, and the servant went down, he opened the door, and asked who it was, and the servant said, it's just some beggar. He wants some food or something. So the king said to the servant, well, okay, let's have a laugh. Now, you know, as we just mentioned about the intrigues in the royal palace and the things that grandparents can say, etc. But, you know, of course, the king is the king. Everybody can do what they want, and the king probably has more license to some degree than others. But still, it's a little bit different. This is a citizen they don't know, and the king's saying, let's have a laugh, call him in. So the servant brought the beggar in upstairs to the king's room, and the king said, oh, all right, what do you want? And the man very meekly, you know, very respectfully, cordially like that, said, I would just like a little prasadam because I'm very, very hungry, I haven't eaten all day, etc. So the king whispered to the servant and said, just pretend to bring him like a big feast like that. So the servant set the beggar down and then came in a little while later with a big tray, and you know, set the tray down, and the plate was covered, took the covering off, and there was basically nothing there. But the king said, just see, your very nice plate is here. And then the beggar, kind of to, you know, obviously he could see there was nothing there, but he didn't want to, I guess, a combination of, you know, upset the king, and I guess he just wanted to go along for whatever reason the king was deciding to do this. So, and as I say, he didn't want to offend him. So the king had said, well, just see, your very nice plate is here. You've got nice rasgullas, samosas, you know, kichoris, etc. So please fill yourself and be happy. And then the beggar, he acted like he was eating, although there was nothing there. Then the king asked him, well, is it good? And the beggar said, oh, it was very good, thank you so much. I especially like the samosas, the non-existent samosas. So the king then said, well, what else would you like? And then the beggar said, well, I'd also like a nice wife. I don't have a wife. And the king said, all right. And he brought in, he got the servant to bring in, you know, some ladies, and they came in. And they were sort of there, and they weren't there because they didn't exist, but supposedly were there. And again, the beggar was going along with all of this. And then the king turned to him and said, you know, which one would you like for your wife, to take as your wife? And the beggar said, oh, I'll have the last one, the fifth one there. And then they arranged an invisible marriage ceremony. And then the king said to him, well, now you have a wife, you know, I think you need a palace. So you can move into a palace with her. Just go out the door, down the road, and you'll see many, many big palaces. So the beggar went out the door, down the road, and of course there was nothing. But the beggar, still in that, came back and still in that unique, not unique, but that meek, and humble kind of disposition, said, "Oh yes, Your Honour, yes, my lord, thank you so much." And he was going out the gate and going down the road to leave. He'd come to get a little prasadam. He was promised prasadam, promised a wife, promised a palace, got absolutely none of them, including the prasadam. But he still left in good humour, in a good mood. And he was just walking down the road. And then the king had a change of heart, seeing that, this was just, whatever, the king was bored and he decided to have a game with this fellow and, was basically making a joke of him, ridiculing him. But the king had a change of heart because he was touched by the submissive response of the beggar to the joke that he was playing. And the king was thinking, I was really trying to make a fool out of this man, trying to insult him, but he's so good-natured that he played along. Most of the people, if not all of the people, would have got him very angry. But, they would have asked, what the hell are you doing? Why are you insulting me like this? But no, this man was very humble, very submissive, very meek. And he went along with the whole thing. So the king said to his servant, actually, follow that man, chase that man, and bring him back. So the servant went and did that, and when he did that and brought him back to the king said to him that he's very pleased. I'm very pleased with your attitude, and you just went along with the joke that I was playing. So now we'll bring out the real prasad. So he brought him out some real prasad, and the man was able to fill his belly and be genuinely happy. And I suppose in the first pastime he was pretending to be happy to some degree, playing along, but now he was fully satisfied. And not only that, the king then did arrange for him to get a nice wife and gave him a palace. So that story told, particularly in the context of or the moral, if you like, of that story, is that, if we maintain a humble nature, something I can honestly say is a struggle at times, that's for sure, but if we can maintain a humble nature, we actually will ultimately be blessed. It is in many ways. I think that in English we have a phrase, to disarm somebody. So if somebody does something wrong to you, you have every justification for reacting in a strong way, absolutely every justification for doing that, but that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the best approach, or doesn't necessarily bring the best outcome. In fact, sometimes by reacting like that, even though it's justified, almost the tables can be turned, and then you become kind of the villain of the piece like that. But the moral of that story is simply that even though someone's playing a joke on you and not treating you nicely, treating you actually very poorly, that if somehow or another you're able to take it in a humble way and not react in a heavy way like that, that ultimately will be to your benefit. So that's exactly what Vidura is trying to do here. He's trying to be humble, and it must be, in that sense, to just leave home. Just leave home with no real plan in place, no real resources in place. And that's why towards the end of the purport, Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira, Prabhupada specifically refers to Mahārāja Yudhiṣṭhira inquiring about how Vidura maintained himself, and talks about free kitchens. And actually this is an interesting thing, because anybody who's been to India, of course we see them very much in the West as well to help people who are struggling like that, but anyone who's been to India, you will see at all holy places the distribution of prasadam is a kind of key part of that, a vital part of that. And Srila Prabhupada himself said that anybody who visits our temples at any time of the day, by the way, that anybody who visits, that the idea is that they can come, they can take darshan, they can see the deity, etc. But that they should also be given some prasadam. They should not leave the temple without being given some prasadam. Then on the other side, if you like, Srila Prabhupada talks about chatras or free kitchens like that, And it's like everything in life, there's two sides to, no matter how thin a chapati, it always has two sides. There's two sides to every coin, because they also have an improper use, where people just see them as a means for, getting a free meal and having no interest in the spiritual side of things like that. So one time in a talk that Prabhupada gave, and this was late actually, this was in 1976, so it was only a year or so before Prabhupada physically left us. And he was talking about Kali Yuga, which of course is Kali Yuga is what we're living in, saying how a Brahman that in Kali Yuga tends to mean, a 2 paisa thread, and then you become a Brahman, that's all. But then Prabhupada was going on to talk about, but that isn't Brahman. Brahman means, samo, dhammo, titiksha, being peaceful, being self-controlled and being tolerant. That's what a Brahman really means, whether you're wearing a thread or not. It's the qualities of Brahminical life that are important. So they're the symptoms, and Brahman isn't simply a dress wearing saffron or wearing the sacred thread like that. But he goes on to then talk about, how, and he's specifically referencing India, because that, of course, is the culture and the tradition there. It may not work so well here. Although I must say, any time that, most people are quite respectful of devotees when they see them. They can generally understand by their dress that they're, people pursuing a kind of spiritual way of life. I know sometimes when sannyasis have visited Ireland and visited Dublin, and I would maybe be walking through the streets with them like that, that even more evokes, that sense. The saffron is so striking, if you like. They may not know in the West, that people may not know the significance of it, but it's quite striking like that, and people do generally have a positive reaction to it. In India, of course, it's just a given. If you're wearing saffron, then that's a big, big thing, and people will very much respect that. But Prabhupada talks about, people taking advantage of that. And even in India today, Prabhupada would say that, even though people are maybe very, 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 very poor, that if a person in saffron arrives at in their village or at their door, then everybody in that village will call that person, they'll invite them to come, they'll, offer them a seat, and they will also feed them prasadam. It's just an instinctive, natural thing that happens with people respecting the dress of a sannyasi like that, or the dress of a sannyasi, or indeed if they know that somebody is a brahman like that. So even today that goes on exactly like that. But some people have taken advantage of that for solving their kind of economic problem. And Prabhupada talks even in Vrindavan, the holiest of holy places, that you'll find so many people who go there because there are so many chatras. He mentions that word chatras, what we're talking about today in the purport, that there are so many chatras there that people go because they know they'll get free chapati, free dal, free sabji like that. So in the morning time, you'll find so many of those people coming, taking their prasadam, but then not participating or not taking advantage of the sacred place that Vrindavan is. As we're talking here, it's one of the tirthas, taking place of the sacredness, the sanctity of Vrindavan, and engaging in service of Krishna by chanting Hare Krishna and engaging in devotional service. Rather, Prabhupada says, what they do is they fill their bellies, in the morning time, generally breakfast, again, breakfast tends to be a very big meal in India. So they fill their bellies early in the day, and then they just go, and sometimes the Prabhupada will make the point, sometimes they even take some of that food, they're full, they take some and even sell it to make some money for themselves. And then they go and buy bidis. They go and smoke cigarettes, etc., smoke bidis like that. So that's the improper use of these chatras. But of course, in this case, Yudhiṣṭhira is just concerned that Vidura, of course, is on a spiritual quest, but that also he's able to be maintained. So Vidura's use of the chatras is the correct use, but what Prabhupada is explaining is the incorrect use of those. Prabhupada talked about that he talked about in Vrindavan, this is for ISKCON, he would talk about it, that in Vrindavan, we should begin a big prasadam distribution program. ISKCON should do that in Vrindavan. And he even commented one time saying that, of course there are many chatras for distributing food, but the difference between our prasadam distribution program and other food distribution programs will be we also will give them Krishna consciousness, and that will make our chatras unique like that. So that's the whole kind of concept of the proper use of chat. Well, I was explaining the improper use. There is a nice story also about Raghunath Das Goswami, who availed of the use of chatras again in the proper way. I mean, Raghunath Das Goswami was an extraordinary personality who had wanted to meet and get the mercy of Lord Chaitanya for an incredibly long time. And finally he left his home and travelled to Vrindavan to try to meet. He had heard that Lord Chaitanya was in Vrindavan or going to Vrindavan, so he travelled there in the hope that he would meet him. He went through Shantipur and Panahati and different places, and on the instruction of Lord Nityananda, he observed different festivals on his way, the Chida Dahi Mahotsava, the distributing chipped rice like that mixed with yogurt. And then the day after that festival, Lord Nityananda then directly gave the blessing for Raghunath Das Goswami that he'd very soon attain the shelter of Lord Chaitanya. But then there'd been some change, I'm not sure of all the details, some change, so then Lord Nityananda indicated that Raghunath Das Goswami should head to Jagannath Puri. And it took him 12 days before he arrived there, which is, interesting. Walking, I guess, would have been the main mode of transport. Maybe there might have been some animals involved, donkeys or whatever, but walking certainly the main mode of transport. So 12 days later he arrived in Jagannath Puri, where he eventually took shelter of Lord Chaitanya. I think before he actually met Lord Chaitanya for 5 days, I think he was taking prasadam at the temple, Jagannath Puri temple, standing at the Singadwara gate in Jagannath Puri temple. Some of you I'm sure will know that. And only a little bit like the Chatra story, he was only taking whatever he was given basically. And then after that, he did actually go directly to chatras or food distribution centres for getting his sustenance. Now, when his father received news of this, he sent men and money to help Raghunath. His father was a well-to-do person, and he didn't like the idea of his son struggling like that, and, if you like, living off the mercy of free prasadam distribution, free food distribution. But when those men came with the money, Raghunath Das Goswami, he just rejected that. He didn't want that. He wanted to live this way again, this renounced way of living. And Lord Chaitanya was so pleased with him when they eventually met that he gave him his own Gunjamala, or garland of conch shells, and also gave him a stone from Govardhan Hill. And then Raghunath Das Goswami even became more kind of renounced. He was only eating rejected food that he would collect and clean, and then just eat that rejected food. It's quite an extraordinary level of renunciation. And of course, when people are able to engage in that level of renunciation, based on and be happy doing it, that's the key thing. I mean, if you try to do that and you're begrudging it, and it makes you angry, and and all of those kind of things, that then you definitely should not do it. But the likes of Raghunath Das Goswami were engaged in this quite extreme level of renunciation. Can you imagine just food that is rejected? I mean, it's kind of like the foxes that will at night time will go around people's bins like that and look in the bins to see if there's anything that's been thrown out. So that's kind of what Raghunath Das Goswami was doing. He was cleaning it before he would then eat it, but he was just that's what he was living from. But as I say, Lord Chaitanya was extremely pleased with this level of renunciation, extraordinary level of renunciation, an extraordinary example of renunciation of Raghunath Das Goswami. But again, so this is the history of chatras in India that exists right up to the present day. So the Vedic literature is there just full of examples of great personalities who took their birth in seemingly common circumstances, for want of a better word, like Vidura, who was born in the womb of a Sudrani, the Sudrani meaning a woman from the Sudra class, which is, the kind of lowest social class in India, anywhere really, actually, but yeah, in India. And I should mention, because we're talking about this, just to quickly, because it's such an important point. Lord Chaitanya spoke, he said, Kibra Vipya, Kibra Nasi, Sudra Kenanai, Ye Krishna Tattvaveta Se Guruhai. And the translation of that verse is that it doesn't matter whether one is a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Brahman or a Sudra. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether one is a sannyasi or a vanaprast or a brahmachari or a grihasta, a married person. Those designations don't matter. All that matters is that one knows the science of Krishna, and then they're qualified to be a guru, qualified to be a spiritual teacher, a spiritual master like that. That's the qualification, knowing the science of Krishna. Your background, what social class you supposedly come from, or what ashram that you're part of, is totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. And this is the big mistake, if you like, of how things have developed in India. That for many people they've become absorbed. That's what Lord Chaitanya rejected as being totally unimportant, they've adopted as being the most important. So if you come from, a Sudra background, then you're just unqualified. That's it, because they're basing it on janma or birth. So if your parents were Sudras, therefore you're a Sudra, and you're trapped in that, and you're useless, for want of a better way of putting it. But of course, Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita that isn't the criteria. The criteria is not janma to determine your status. The criteria is your guna and your karma. So your guna, the modes of nature that you're operating under, and of course it's within every one of us, has it within our power to operate at the highest standard in terms of the modes of nature, modes of goodness, and beyond the mode of goodness, Sudasattva or pure goodness. It doesn't matter where we come from, including from Western births, because again, whatever about the caste system in India and them looking down, the higher caste looking down on the lower caste, they look even further down on people from the West, because we're, from their perspective we're lower than Sudras, and in many ways it's true. That's true what they say. But Krishna's point and Srila Prabhupada's point is, but that doesn't matter. You can elevate yourself. And if you're engaged in mode of goodness activity, what to speak of transcendental activity in terms of Krishna consciousness, then all of those trappings are irrelevant to you. And again, going back to Lord Chaitanya's verse, Kibra Vipakivinasi Sudra Kenanai Ye Krishna Tattvaveta Se Guruhai, that once you know the science of Krishna, once you're engaged in devotional service, you're accepting Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and you're living your life in a way that reflects that understanding that you're the eternal servant of, we're all the eternal servant of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then you're qualified to you're on the highest level of spiritual realization, that you're in the highest level of spiritual practice, and you're qualified to serve in the highest realms of devotional service, i.e. being a spiritual teacher for everybody else. So Prabhupada, he made this point constantly in his lectures, in his books, that our birth is unimportant. Our bodily designation, our material designation is unimportant. These things are unimportant. Why? Because they're temporary. Simple. They are not us. We're an eternal spiritual being, an eternal spirit soul, And that's what we need to focus on and understand. And once we actually understand that principle, then all of these material designations, no meaning. They don't touch us, because the soul and the body are completely different. Prabhupada, of course, is a subject that he talked about so much, demonstrating that the soul is unaffected by its material surroundings. And Srila Prabhupada cited one lovely example he cited in relation to that the soul and the body are completely different, and the soul is unaffected by its material contact and what it's connected to. The example that he gave was that the moon, when you're looking at it through water, if you're at a lake on a clear night with a full moon, and you see the moon reflected in the water, and out, the moon is in the firmament is completely steady and fixed like that. But when you see it on the water, it apparently is moving. But that apparent movement is really just the rippling effect in the water. The moon itself is not moving. So the Bhagavad Gita and other Vedic literatures, they state this time and time again, confirming that the soul's transcendental nature over matter. There's one nice statement in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, talking about those with the vision of eternity. They can see the soul as it is, transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. And despite contact with this material body, Krishna is telling Arjuna that the soul neither does anything nor is entangled by anything. The sky, due to its subtle nature, does not mix with anything, though it's all pervading. So again, that if you look at the sky on a cloudy day, today's a beautiful, clear day, but but we won't have to wait long before we get clouds, don't worry. But if you look at that, sometimes you think that's the sky. Many people, they kind of think like that. They look up and say, but it's not. The sky is totally unaffected. And of course, when you fly in an airplane, you see that clearly. You break through the clouds, and then the sky is a totally different thing than anything to do with clouds or anything below it, if you like. So Krishna is saying that to Arjuna, that the soul doesn't mix with anything, though, just like the sky doesn't mix with anything, though it's all pervading. So all of these points are made throughout Srila Prabhupada's books, and this is the key thing for us to understand. The key thing. Sometimes certain things happen in life. This pandemic, as an example, would be a good example, and it's kind of all pervasive almost. It's kind of affecting the whole planet. Everybody is affected, so it's very easy to get kind of caught up in that. In what you might call, what's that word I'm looking for? Caught up in the hysteria of something like that. That's affecting the whole world. Everybody in the world is affected by it. But it's temporary. It's temporary, And I remember years ago, we were having a Sunday feast program actually, and there was quite a lot of new people at the Sunday feast. And the question came out, and it comes up, it's come up more than once, but one person asked the question, why does God make us suffer, and why does God, make us die? Something had happened, actually. The person asked the question because something had happened that externally you could argue, well, why didn't God intervene to stop that? And I remember the devotee in their answer, they said, yes, it can seem like that. So there's something terrible, like one of these mass shootings that tend to happen in America. That can seem so unfair and so cruel that someone takes out a gun and just shoots innocent people. But the devotee in his answer, I just thought it was such a good answer. He said that, it's true, and it can seem like that, and we can get caught up in that understanding. But actually, even if there was never a mass shooting, ever, there was never an earthquake, there was never a tsunami, there was never a pandemic, there was never any of these things, they just never ever happened, that we all still die. So rather than when something specific happens and then we want to look to God and sort of point the finger at God, why are you allowing this to happen? Why don't we just do that with our general normal existence? Because time And Krishna, of course, tells us in Bhagavad Gita, Kaloshmi, time I am, destroyer of the worlds. Time is the impersonal representation of the Supreme Person, which also brings about death for every living creature in the material world. Once you take birth, whatever species you're in, once you take birth in the material world, then it is guaranteed that you have to die. So rather than looking at specific details and getting caught up in those, like, as I say, this current pandemic, that we step back and see the kind of bigger picture, the broader picture of all of this, and just understand, one, that yes, the reality is all of this is temporary, and that if we identify with who we really are, the eternal spiritual being, and engage in service to the Supreme Person, then no matter what it is, whether it's a pandemic, a road crash, or a tsunami, whatever the situation is, old age, whatever it might be, that it won't affect us. It literally won't affect us, because we're operating on the platform of eternality. And by definition, eternality means there can never be an end. And we won't be affected by any of these temporary material considerations. And then, of course, finally, and this will be the final thing I will say actually, in terms of blaming God for those temporary situations, the actual truth is, the reality is that God, Krishna, does not want us to be here, does not want us to be suffering, and only arranges, and doesn't do it directly but indirectly, only arranges for the creation of this material world because we have a desire for it. Krishna will fulfill all desires, which is a wonderful thing, because any spiritual desires that we have, we should grow and build on them, because Krishna will fulfill them. And that will be something, the bliss and the ecstasy of that will be beyond anything we can conceive of. So it's wonderful that Krishna fulfills all our desires. However, if we have material desires, Krishna will also fulfill those too, because that's our desire, that's our free will. So therefore, if we want to have temporary material life, to experience it and to see what it's like, not being the servant, trying to be the master here in this material world, Krishna will fulfill that. And that's why these material universes are created. So any suffering that comes along with them is simply because of the desire for us to be here. But to solve that problem, because that is where we are right now, we are in this material world, it's so simple. As Krishna tells us, Krishna sitting in our heart, that's where the soul is residing in the body, in that general area. Krishna's there also. We simply, instead of turning that way, actually, and I'll do it the other way, it's better because it's nice, that looks nice and bright there. Instead of turning that way and turning away from Krishna and just focusing on material life and absorbing ourselves in material life, that for, whatever reason appears attractive or we think is attractive or whatever the case may be. But once we understand that part of that package is also incredible suffering and difficulties and problems, that we simply just turn around and turn that way and look now at Krishna, everything, just like the light, with light all darkness is removed. So we turn to the light of Krishna sitting in our heart, all darkness, all problems, all challenges, all suffering, everything is just instantaneously removed. The power is exclusively in our hands to do that. And though externally sometimes, like the example of Raghunath Das Goswami in his renunciation, or Vidura in the what we're reading today, that went and left home. Can you imagine just walking out your door now, leaving home and never coming back, and just relying on Krishna ultimately for providing whatever we need to keep body and soul together. Externally, that seems like a massive challenge, but that turning to Krishna, once we do that, and these devotees, all of them, whoever they are, these great souls like Vidura, like Queen Kunti, like Prahlad, like Haridas Thakur, who was only, we're only talking like 500 years ago in relation to Haridas Thakur, and all the suffering and challenges that he was put through. Oh, incredible actually, but he's the Namacharya, because he depended on the holy name, that he'd got that title, Namacharya, and he was blissful. He was just constantly experiencing bliss, as all of these other devotees were too. So that's the thing. Externally, from a temporary point of view, it looks like a challenge, it looks like a problem, it looks something that's insurmountable. But actually, a simple turning to Krishna resolves all of those challenges and puts us, I was going to say, on the path. It's not really that it puts us on the path. The path and the destination are simultaneously one and the same, and therefore we immediately experience unlimited spiritual ecstasy as a result of doing that very act of turning to Krishna. So let me leave you then today with that message. And I'm giving this message to myself as much as I'm giving it to anybody else. Let's today try to turn more towards Krishna. So yeah, that's the turn. So maybe because of the challenges and the difficult situation we find that harder to do. But let's at least turn a little bit towards Krishna today, and then tomorrow a little bit more, and the next day a little bit more, and the next day a little bit more. And before we know it, we'll be fully facing Krishna like that. And that will be the perfection of turning all the way to Krishna. Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna, and all glories to our divine spiritual master, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, without whom none of this information and none of the glories of spiritual life would actually be available to us. So thank you, Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.